I don't tell many people why I stayed on at Harlan Farm after Earl died. Most folks around Millhaven assumed I had nowhere better to go. A 44-year-old widower with cracked knuckles and a daughter who wore her mother's old boots 2 sizes too big. That was fine with me. I've never needed the world to understand my reasons. But I knew the day the new owner would show up. I'd been expecting her for 3 weeks, ever since Earl's attorney left a voicemail telling me the estate had sold. Cash offer. One viewing, no inspection. He said the buyer was some kind of development executive out of Columbus, and when I asked what she planned to do with 70 acres of apple orchards and a 19th century farmhouse, he just cleared his throat. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, which is the worst possible time to look at an orchard if you want to be unimpressed. The trees were bare, the access road was soft with mud, and the morning fog hadn't lifted. A charcoal-colored SUV nosed up the drive like it wasn't sure the ground would hold it. I was pruning the Roxbury russets along the fence line when she stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, dressed for a city meeting, wool coat, leather boots that were not made for mud, and she had the look of someone who had already decided what she was going to do and was here only to confirm it. She glanced at the orchard, then at me, and said, "You must be Briggs." "Yes, ma'am." She introduced herself as Meredith Cole, said she'd reviewed the tenancy agreement Earl had drawn up, and that she would honor it through the end of the season. She used the word transition 3 times in 2 minutes. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. What I did not tell her was that the orchard she was standing beside was the only remaining working stand of Calvert Gold apples in the state. Earl and my wife Joanna had spent 6 years bringing it back from a fungal blight that had killed every other heritage planting in the county. Joanna died before she saw the first full harvest. I'd finished what she started 1 row at a time for the 4 years since. Meredith Cole did not ask about any of that. She was already walking toward the farmhouse, making notes on her phone. Clara came down for breakfast just as Meredith was finishing her walkthrough of the main house. My daughter was 10, and she had inherited Joanna's habit of going straight to the thing nobody else wanted to address. She looked at Meredith across the kitchen table and said, "Are you selling it to someone who'll tear it out?" Meredith blinked. "I haven't made any decisions yet. The trees, I mean. My mom planted the last row, the third one from the fence." There was a pause. Meredith looked at me, then back at Clara. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't," Clara said, and poured herself a glass of milk. That was the first morning. I didn't expect a second one. But Meredith Cole came back the next day, and the day after that. She said she was assessing the property's development profile, which I took to mean she was figuring out how to subdivide it. She set up a folding table in the front room with her laptop, and a long-distance Wi-Fi router she'd brought from the city, and she worked there while I went about the days pruning and mulching. We were polite to each other the way two people are when they both know one of them is leaving, and neither wants to say it yet. On the fourth morning, the router signal dropped. She came to the barn looking for me. I was mixing a lime sulfur spray for the dormant trees, and she stood in the doorway long enough that I asked if she needed something. "Your internet." "I don't have any." "Earl had a landline. It's still connected if you need it." She stared at me like I'd told her the barn was made of sailcloth. Then she pulled out a chair from the corner, sat down and said, "All right, tell me about the trees." I set down my mixing bucket. "Which part?" "The part where a man spends 4 years keeping 70 acres alive by himself after his wife dies. That part." So I told her, not everything. I'm not built for that kind of conversation with a stranger, but enough. I told her about the Calvert Gold, which was a heritage apple variety that hadn't been commercially grown since the 1940s and was resistant to the scab strains that had been devastating Ohio orchards for 2 decades. I told her that Earl and Joanna had sourced the original rootstock from a single surviving tree in a retired botanist's backyard in Lancaster, and that the Ohio Heritage Orchard Society had been trying for 3 years to get the Harlan stand placed on the State Preservation Registry. The paperwork was sitting in Earl's office, half finished. Meredith listened without her phone in her hand, which I noticed. "Why didn't Earl finish the paperwork?" she asked. "He was 81 and he didn't like forms." I paused, and he didn't think he needed to. He thought the land would speak for itself. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he was wrong about that. "Yes, ma'am, he was." She looked around the barn, at the grafting bench, the soil logs Joanna had kept in a green binder, the labeled sample jars of rootstock material lined up on the shelf. "Is all of this documented?" "Everything Joanna started, I kept going. Soil tests, spray logs, yield records, the grafting notes. 12 years of records. Where?" I pointed at the green binder, and then at the 6 beside it. She stood and walked to the shelf. She ran one finger along the spines of the binders and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she pulled the first one down and opened it to the middle. Joanna's handwriting, small and careful, recording soil pH and rainfall and the first signs of scab pressure the summer we almost lost the East Block. I watched Meredith's face while she read. She had the look of someone who'd been expecting a storage room and walked into a library. "This is years of work," she said. "Yes, ma'am, one person. Two, for the first part." She closed the binder and held it for a moment before setting it back exactly where it had been. That struck me. People who think a place is theirs to do with as they please don't put things back carefully. Clara found us still in the barn an hour later. She'd walked down from the school bus stop and apparently decided that whatever was happening was more interesting than her homework because she settled onto a hay bale and started asking Meredith questions about Columbus. Meredith answered them, which surprised me. She had an 11-year-old niece, she said, who also had strong opinions about everything. By the time I sent Clara up to the house for supper, she and Meredith were debating the relative merits of city libraries versus the county bookmobile. That evening, after Clara was in bed, Meredith knocked on the kitchen door. I poured 2 cups of coffee and we sat at the table where Joanna and I had eaten every meal for 9 years. "I told my board this was a tax play," Meredith said. "Is it? It was supposed to be. 70 acres of undeveloped rural land, sell the timber rights, maybe do a small residential subdivision on the north parcel." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I didn't tell them the real reason I bought it. I waited. My father grew up on a farm about 12 miles east of here. He talked about it his whole life. The apple harvests, the way the fog sat in the rows in the morning, the smell of the lime spray in October. He died 6 years ago. When Earl's property came on the market, I saw the county, and She stopped. "I made an offer before I'd thought it through." "I'm glad you did." She looked at me. "I mean that," I said. "Earl worried about what would happen to it. He didn't say so, but I could tell. What did you think would happen? I thought it would go to someone who'd pull the trees out. Most of the developers who've looked at this county have. The land's worth more cleared than planted on paper." Meredith set her cup down. "The Heritage Orchard Society letter, the one to Earl. Is there a contact name on it?" "Dr. Patricia Vance. She's at Ohio State. I have her number." Meredith nodded slowly. Then she said, "If I filed the preservation paperwork, finished what Earl started, would the trust arrangement allow you to stay on as the operator?" I thought about Joanna's green binders on the shelf, about the 3rd row from the fence line which would bloom again in April, about Clara, who had never known any other home. "It would," I said. "That's exactly what it was written for." She picked up her cup again and looked out the dark window toward the orchard. "I have some calls to make in the morning," she said, "and I'm going to need your Wi-Fi. I'll get the landline cord." The corner of her mouth moved. That was as close to a smile as I'd seen from her in 2 weeks, and it was enough. She filed the preservation application with Dr. Vance's office on a Thursday, 3 weeks after she'd first driven up that muddy access road in her city boots. The Harlan Farm Heritage Orchard was granted preliminary state recognition the following spring, the first Calvert Gold planting to receive that status in Ohio in 40 years. I was pruning the 3rd row from the fence when Clara brought me the letter. She read the first line out loud, then folded it carefully and handed it to me the way she handles things that matter. "Mom would have thought this was a big deal," she said. "It is a big deal, I know." She wiped her hands on her jeans, Meredith called. "She wants to know if she can come for the bloom." Meredith had been back 4 times since October. She'd started bringing her laptop and working from the front room, the way she had at the beginning. But she'd stopped talking about development profiles. She'd also brought a pair of boots that were actually made for mud. I said Clara could tell her yes. I went back to pruning. The fog was still in the rows, just like she'd described her father describing it, and the Calvert Golds stood bare and patient against the gray sky, the way they'd stood every winter for the past 12 years, waiting for someone to take the trouble to understand what they were. I'd learned a long time ago that the right people eventually do,